Good morning, ED348. I thought it would be helpful if I created a video and went over each section of the lesson plan template with you. So if you had any questions or wanted to start working on this before we have class next week, you can access this video at any time. So I'm going to get started. So in the learner section of the lesson plan template, this is where you really want to give the reader of the lesson plan information about the students so that anyone could just pick up this lesson plan and understand where your students are at. So describe who your learners are. So how many students are in the class total, how many girls, how many boys, any English language learners in the classroom, any students that are special ed or have exceptional learning needs. You want to put that in this section. And then what is their general level of development? So where are they at in terms of literacy, math, or whatever content area you're focusing your lesson on? And then what are the students' interests, and then what are their lived-in experiences? And how does that information and how do those things connect to this lesson? So I just wanted to read you a quick learners section example from a student's lesson plan template. There are 35 students in the class, 18 boys and 17 girls. From my observations, I've noticed that the students vary in terms of literacy development. Most are at level for kindergarten. Some struggle with one-to-one correspondence. They don't point to the correct word as they read. However, when I ask them to point out a specific word from any given sentence, they are usually successful. A few have demonstrated advanced reading skills, the ability to track text visually without having to point with a finger or manipulative. These students are beginning to read more expressively. They seem to have awareness of implications of punctuation. As for science, it's my understanding that the students are familiar with the concept of sinking and floating. I may have to do a brief reintroduction or refresher. Something else that could be added to that section just is talking about what the students like to do, like hands-on learning. They like to collaborate in small groups, just giving the reader all the information they need about the students. Moving on to the next section. The next section talks about the students' prior learning. So what do the students already know before you're going to teach this lesson? So you can consider a variety of factors: assessment data, teacher observations, standardized testing, data, or other sources that will help inform you about the student's strengths and areas of growth. You can also collaborate with your mentor teacher about what the students already know before you're doing your lesson. And the next section, rationale. So this is your why. Why are you teaching this lesson? What is the point of it? And really you want to go back to those Common Core State Standards or Wisconsin Model Early Learning Standards as to why you are teaching this lesson and how it's going to support your students' learning and understanding in the future. The accommodations and strategies for differentiation section is where you're going to put in those pieces of the lesson where you're going to support all the learners in your classroom. So what are the needed supports or additional rigor needed for individuals or subgroups to demonstrate high learning outcomes? So this is a section where you can address the IEP needs of your students and then also just the regular general ed students. Some students need, students are across the board in terms of levels of learning. So this is where you want to put in those differentiation skills and strategies. What might be some difficulties students might encounter during this lesson, and how do you plan to support them with those challenges? So put lots of details in this section of how you can modify your lesson to meet the needs of students that might be struggling or students that might have a stronger understanding of the skills that you're working on. Moving to outcomes and goals, this is where you're going to put the Common Core State Standards or the Wisconsin Model Early Learning Standards if you're working in an early childhood classroom. Make sure you put the letters and numbers that correspond with the standard and then also write out the entire standard. That way whoever's reading the lesson plan will know what goals you're focusing on. And then the learning objectives should be directly connected to each standard. So what do you want the students to be able to do as a result of this learning experience? Make sure that you frame your response in an I can statement. So I can identify uppercase letters. I can identify parts of a plant. Just some examples. And then moving on to the assessment. How are you going to understand if your students have learned from this lesson, or how can you gauge what the students already know? So what are the multiple ways in which you will know whether your students have learned and how deeply they have learned? What elements of choice in showing their learning can you provide to students? Describe a formative, so just an informal assessment, or a summative, a final assessment. It can be either or. Provide examples of how you would keep track of students' learning. So are you going to use a chart? Will you write anecdotal notes? Do you need a rubric? And if you are observing their work, make sure you have a detailed description of how you're going to collect and then later analyze that data. That all goes in the assessment section. You can also put ideas for student self-assessments in that section. The academic language demands are the oral, visual, and written language that the students need in order to understand and use to complete learning tasks successfully within this learning segment. So they're embedded in instructional activities, and you want to make sure you include what they understand, how they can communicate, and if there's a performance section. The language demands include function, vocabulary, symbols, syntax, or discourse. The focus should be on new or partially mastered language demands that are essential to the planned learning tasks. I also gave you a handout on the first day of class that goes into more detail about that section, that gives you a better explanation of how to complete that section. So just focusing on key vocabulary in those 3 areas. The materials and resources section is where what do you need for this lesson? Do you need to switch up the room at all? Do you need any anchor charts or visuals for this lesson? Anything that you need in order to complete this lesson should be in this section. And then if you're flipping the lesson, so if this is a virtual lesson where the students are going to be doing activities online, what online resources or learning experiences are going to be connected with this lesson? The procedures section of the lesson is where you're going to describe in detail how you're going to teach this lesson. So for the beginning of the lesson, how are you going to engage students in learning, and how are you going to hook those students in? And then make sure you write down what open-ended questions you might ask the students to activate their curiosity and wonder and really get them excited for the learning for this lesson. And then what connections can you make to their interests and strengths? So going back to that learner section where you described who your students are, how can you get the beginning of this lesson going using that information? And then moving on to the next section, the demonstration and modeling. How will you help and support the students and understanding and knowing what they're supposed to be able to do? So what are you going to be demonstrating and modeling for students? Where will you and the students be during this time? So when you're doing the demonstration and modeling of how this lesson is going to unfold, where will the students be? Are they going to be in a whole group place on the carpet area? Will they be at tables or desks? Or are they going to be each at their own computers in their own home when you're doing the demonstration piece if you're doing a virtual lesson? So be specific about how you're going to model for the students and then where the students will be while you're modeling. Individual or group exploration and practice. So are the students going to be working on the task for the lesson individually, or will they be doing it collaboratively in small groups? Will they be in a Google Hangout breakout room? Will they be in a Zoom breakout room? Will they be working completely on their own? And how you support their thinking as they engage with ideas. And then be very specific and detailed in this section. And then you can use a timeline for the tasks and the activities that the students will carry out in this section. Sharing and celebration. How will the students exchange and share their work? How will you select students for sharing? And how do you anticipate that you will connect their individual and their group work with learning objectives and assessment methods? So think back to this week's class when each group created their own slide for our Google slide presentation, and then each group was allowed to share what they created and explain in greater detail. How can you give those opportunities to your students? How can you allow students to see what each other were doing during the lesson and really celebrate the learning process? And then closure and transition. How are you going to wrap up this learning opportunity and make an effective transition into the next area of learning? And then the last section down here is really important. How can you flexibly adapt your lesson plan if you run out of time? So when is another time where you could finish this lesson or make sure students have time to finish the task part of the lesson? And if things go more quickly, so if students are finishing quickly or you're getting through the material really quickly and there's not a lot of extra discussion, what can be your plan for making sure that there's more things for you to discuss or more things for the students to do during this lesson? Okay, I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about any of the sections, please let me know. Otherwise, bring your questions to class next week. Thanks.